Welcome to the Trackpad's Military History Podcast, where we bring the terrain, the tactics, and the stories of soldiers to life. Each episode goes deeper than the written article, giving you a front-row seat to the battles that shaped history. Discover more at trackpads.com.
The story of amphibious warfare begins with an image that is at once fragile and audacious. Men in small boats rowing toward a hostile shore. At dawn on April 25, 1915, Allied troops pushed through the swells of the Aegean toward the beaches of Gallipoli, where Ottoman rifles and machine guns waited on the cliffs above. 35 years later, in September 1950, Marines of the United States stormed the seawalls of Inchon, climbing ladders under fire as the tide threatened to strand them. These two moments, separated by a generation, reveal the peril and promise of projecting power from sea to land. They also frame the central question of our journey. How did the world's militaries transform amphibious warfare from improvised disaster to orchestrated mastery? Amphibious operations are unlike any other kind of battle. They demand that soldiers face not only an enemy but the raw forces of nature itself. Tides, currents, reefs, mud, and the constraining geography of coasts. Unlike battles fought inland, where maneuver space can be expanded, the landing force begins its assault confined to narrow strips of shoreline. Timing becomes a weapon, geography an opponent, and every error is magnified by the sea's unforgiving character. The tension at the water's edge is elemental. Soldiers step from boats, knowing they are exposed, vulnerable, and often without cover until they claw their way inland. What makes amphibious warfare so fascinating is the way it fuses daring with meticulous detail. Success depends not only on the courage of troops in the first wave, but also on the unseen systems behind them. Hydrographic surveys that chart tides, engineers who devise landing craft, and planners who choreograph fire support down to the minute. At Gallipoli, those elements were missing or poorly understood, and the results were catastrophic. At Inchon, those same elements were combined into a symphony of precision, turning geography's obstacles into the very instruments of surprise. Between those two poles lies the story of how militaries learned to fight the sea as much as the enemy. This journey from Gallipoli to Inchon is more than a sequence of battles. It is the evolution of doctrine, technology, and human leadership under the most extreme conditions. It is about commanders who gambled on bold ideas, soldiers who carried ladders into fire, and sailors who piloted fragile craft through reefs and surf. Each landing became a laboratory of lessons, some learned in blood, others refined through rehearsal, that gradually transformed amphibious warfare into a discipline of exacting art. To understand this evolution is to appreciate not only the history of war, but the enduring challenge of projecting force across the world's littorals. The attempt to seize Gallipoli in 1915 was born from strategic desperation and flawed assumptions. British leaders, urged on by Winston Churchill as First Lord of the Admiralty, believed that forcing the Dardanelles would break the Ottoman Empire, open a sea route to Russia, and tip the balance of the war. The plan looked elegant on paper, but it rested on wishful thinking about the power of naval bombardment and the weakness of Ottoman defenses. In reality, the Turks, advised and supported by German officers, were well prepared to defend the peninsula. Gallipoli became a gamble, where Allied troops carried the burden of strategic miscalculation, rowing into killing zones designed by terrain and made lethal by determined defenders. The landscape of Gallipoli was not a beachhead waiting to be taken. It was a fortress sculpted by nature. Beaches like V Beach and Anzac Cove were narrow, hemmed in by cliffs and dominated by ridges such as Sari Bair. These positions gave Ottoman riflemen and machine gunners commanding fields of fire. The straits themselves were mined, and coastal artillery made naval bombardment hazardous and often ineffective. When landing boats crept toward shore, they entered a gauntlet where every yard of surf was covered by fire from above. Geography turned the simplest task, crossing a strip of sand, into an ordeal of survival. Leadership on the Ottoman side sharpened these natural advantages. Mustafa Kemal, a divisional commander who would later found modern Turkey, showed remarkable initiative. When he saw Allied troops coming ashore, he rushed reserves forward, ordering men to dig in on key ridges even before reinforcements arrived. His decisiveness stood in stark contrast to Allied commanders, who hesitated, delayed, or failed to coordinate between British, Australian, New Zealand, and French contingents. The result was that every landing became contested from the moment boats hit the water, with defenders always a step ahead of hesitant attackers. The tactics at the shoreline compounded the Allies' misery. At V Beach, troops poured out of the converted collier River Clyde, only to be slaughtered in narrow exits under withering crossfire. At Suvla Bay, where an opening existed for rapid exploitation, confusion and delay squandered the chance to seize high ground. At Anzac Cove, Australians and New Zealanders clawed up cliffs in desperate assaults, only to be pinned down by defenders who dominated the ridgelines. Every misstep at the tactical level magnified the larger strategic folly, leaving Allied soldiers trapped on shallow beachheads that offered no protection from artillery or counterattack. For the men on the ground, Gallipoli was misery layered upon fear. The summer heat drained strength, and water was in constant short supply. Flies swarmed over trenches, spreading disease and making every meal a torment. Medical evacuation was slow and inadequate. Wounded men often lay exposed for hours in the surf or languished on overcrowded hospital ships. Morale eroded as offensive operations bled men for little gain, turning the campaign into a stalemate of trench warfare on a peninsula too small to maneuver. The soldiers endured, but endurance was not enough to redeem a plan doomed by its conception. Gallipoli became synonymous with the perils of amphibious hubris. The aftermath of Gallipoli left militaries shaken and searching for answers. The scale of the disaster was too immense to ignore. More than 250,000 Allied casualties, a campaign abandoned in humiliation, and the sobering realization that courage alone could not overcome poor planning. In Britain, Gallipoli forced the Royal Navy and Army to reflect on the dangers of divided command and the folly of assuming that naval guns alone could suppress entrenched defenders. For the United States, which had observed from afar, the campaign became a cautionary tale. American officers studied Gallipoli as a negative model, a case study of how not to attempt a landing against a fortified shore. The failure imprinted itself so deeply that when the Marine Corps began to professionalize its own doctrine, Gallipoli stood as a constant warning. The U.S. Marine Corps emerged as the service most determined to turn failure into instruction. Through the 1920s and 1930s, Marines at the Naval War College in Quantico dissected every lesson of Gallipoli, asking how technology, organization, and rehearsals might overcome the tyranny of the beach. Their work culminated in the 1934 Tentative Manual for Landing Operations, a document that transformed amphibious warfare from improvisation into a codified science. The manual emphasized that a landing against resistance required detailed coordination between naval and ground forces, precise timing, and an understanding that the first wave had to be reinforced immediately or risk annihilation. It also made logistics, not glory, the centerpiece of planning, recognizing that sustaining troops ashore was the true determinant of success. Technology kept pace with doctrine. Andrew Higgins, a boat builder from New Orleans, developed flat-bottomed craft with bow ramps that could disgorge men and vehicles directly onto beaches. These Higgins boats became the workhorses of future amphibious assaults, capable of operating in shallow water where traditional ships' boats would ground out. Larger landing ship tanks, LSTs, were designed to carry heavy armor and trucks straight onto sandbars and quays, eliminating the dependency on captured ports. Amphibious tractors, or LVTs, provided the ability to crawl over reefs and mudflats, bridging the final yards where boats might falter. By the late 1930s, militaries possessed not just the theory, but the hardware to attempt landings with a level of efficiency unthinkable in 1915. Rehearsal became the backbone of preparation. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps conducted fleet landing exercises, or FLEX, throughout the interwar years, turning beaches in the Caribbean and Pacific into classrooms of trial and error. These exercises tested wave control, timing, and the role of beachmasters officers tasked with directing traffic at the surf line. The choreography resembled a ballet, with each boat, each wave, and each support fire mission assigned to a precise slot. Errors during flex became hard lessons learned in safety rather than in blood, and they forged a generation of officers who would later command in the Pacific. For the Marines, amphibious assault was no longer an improvisation but a profession. Intelligence and reconnaissance also advanced far beyond the guesswork of Gallipoli. Aerial photography became standard practice, allowing planners to map obstacles, beach gradients, and inland terrain. Hydrographic surveys provided detailed tide tables and surf predictions. Some of the earliest underwater demolition experiments began in this period, foreshadowing the role of frogmen and later Navy SEALs. Specialized reconnaissance teams conducted covert insertions to scout beaches firsthand, gathering the kind of granular information that had been absent in 1915. By the eve of World War II, Amphibious doctrine recognized that the beach itself was a battlefield to be studied with as much rigor as any inland objective. The greatest change of all was the elevation of logistics from background detail to combat priority. At Gallipoli, water shortages and medical chaos had crippled operations within days. In the interwar doctrine, supply, casualty evacuation, and engineering support were given pride of place. Assault echelons were carefully structured, with follow-up echelons designed to bring in reinforcements and sustainment in sequence. Shore parties were organized into specialized teams for clearing obstacles, establishing dumps, and evacuating wounded. The new thinking was blunt. Bravery at the water's edge was useless if ammunition could not be landed, if wounded could not be evacuated, or if reinforcements arrived too late. Amphibious warfare was not just about seizing sand, it was about holding it, supplying it, and turning it into a springboard for further action. The interwar years, then, were a laboratory where failure was transmuted into doctrine. What Gallipoli had exposed in blood, the next generation tried to solve with manuals, machines, and meticulous training. It was a transformation from chaos to choreography, from gamble to calculated risk. The men who trained on those Caribbean beaches or studied those hydrographic charts would soon test their ideas against real fire in the Pacific and Europe. And when they did, they would discover that while no landing was ever easy, preparation could make the difference between slaughter on the sand and a foothold inland. The Pacific theater of World War II became the true crucible, where interwar doctrine was tested under the harshest possible conditions. When U.S. Marines splashed ashore at Guadalcanal in August 1942, it was the first major Allied offensive against Japan and a trial by fire for amphibious planning. The initial landings faced little opposition, but the real struggle began almost immediately. Japanese naval forces contested the surrounding seas, sinking supply ships and forcing American troops to live on dwindling rations. On land, Japanese counterattacks pressed hard against the fragile lodgment. Guadalcanal taught that an amphibious landing was only the beginning of a campaign, not its conclusion, and that without secure sea control and logistics, even the most successful assault could collapse. The lessons in endurance, improvisation, and sustaining power across an ocean were bitter but invaluable. At Tarawa, in November 1943, the doctrine collided with a reef. American planners had miscalculated tides, assuming landing craft could cross the coral barrier to reach the beach. When the tides fell short, Higgins' boats stranded hundreds of yards offshore, leaving Marines to wade chest-deep through surf and fire. Japanese defenders, well dug in, inflicted appalling casualties. Only the amphibious tractors, the LVTs, could crawl over the reef and deliver troops directly onto the sand. Tarawa revealed the brutality of contested landings. Short beaches covered by interlocking fire, pillboxes that survived bombardment, and an enemy resolved to fight to the last. The cost in lives shocked the public back home, but the operation also validated the necessity of specialized vehicles, improved bombardments, and precise hydrographic intelligence. As the island campaign advanced, amphibious warfare matured into a highly coordinated system. At Saipan and Tinian in 1944, The Navy and Marines demonstrated a level of integration that Gallipoli's planners could never have imagined. Carrier-based aircraft suppressed defenses inland while battleships and cruisers laid down rolling barrages. Engineers, Seabees, and shore parties established dumps and routes within hours of landing. The landings revealed that seizing the beach was not enough. Planners had to think in depth, pushing beachheads inland to deny the enemy artillery vantage points and create maneuver space. These operations underscored that amphibious mastery was less about brute courage in the first wave and more about orchestration across air, sea, and land domains. The brutal campaigns of Iwo Jima and Okinawa showed both the limits and the strength of the system. At Iwo Jima, weeks of bombardment barely dented the labyrinth of Japanese caves and tunnels. Marines advancing through volcanic ash found every step exhausting, and every bunker concealed another lethal pocket of resistance. Underwater demolition teams, precursors to Navy SEALs, risked their lives clearing obstacles just offshore, highlighting the critical role of specialized reconnaissance. At Okinawa, the challenge extended beyond the beaches. The landings themselves were initially unopposed, but the campaign dragged into months of grinding combat inland, while the fleet endured relentless kamikaze attacks. Amphibious warfare had become a complex enterprise that could deliver armies ashore, but it could not make the fighting that followed any less grueling. For the soldiers, sailors, and Marines, the Pacific was a crucible of human endurance as much as doctrine. Marines clambered down cargo nets into landing craft, sweating under tropical sun before hitting beaches swept by fire. Sailors piloted fragile Higgins boats through surf and burning oil slicks, sometimes only to be destroyed in seconds. Seabees transformed coral strips into airfields under artillery fire, while corpsmen carried wounded men through bloody surf to evacuation boats. Each landing left scars, but each also left lessons. The Pacific Campaign proved beyond doubt that amphibious warfare could succeed against fierce resistance if doctrine, technology, and logistics worked in unison. And those lessons would echo far beyond the island chains of Micronesia, shaping how armies thought about storming shores in Europe and, ultimately, Korea. The Mediterranean became the first large-scale testing ground for Allied amphibious operations in Europe, and it showed just how complex coalition warfare could be when conducted from the sea. In November 1942, Operation Torch marked America's baptism into modern amphibious war. U.S. troops, green and untested, landed alongside British forces on the coasts of French North Africa. The landings were marred by navigation errors, scattered units, and the delicate political situation of fighting Vichy French forces who were not always eager to resist. Despite these frictions, Torch offered invaluable experience. The Allies learned how to assemble and protect vast convoys, how to coordinate naval fire with land advances, and how to balance the demands of diplomacy with the urgency of combat. Torch was far from perfect, but it demonstrated that amphibious power could be projected across an ocean in coalition. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943, Operation Husky, expanded the scale and ambition. With hundreds of thousands of troops and vast fleets, Husky became one of the largest amphibious assaults of the war to that point. Yet even here, nature and friction intervened. Heavy winds scattered paratroopers, and poor navigation led to units landing in the wrong sectors. German and Italian defenders mounted stiff resistance, and confusion reigned at times on the beaches. Still, the operation succeeded in putting Allied armies ashore and forcing Axis retreat. Husky reinforced the importance of rehearsals and navigation, but it also revealed how fragile even the best-laid plans could be when weather and darkness intervened. Amphibious warfare demanded not just planning, but resilience in the face of chaos. The landings at Salerno in September 1943 introduced a new problem: how to endure immediate counterattack. The beaches were within range of German armor and artillery, and the Wehrmacht responded swiftly, threatening to drive the Allies back into the sea. What saved the lodgment was not brilliance on land, but the crushing weight of naval gunfire, which pounded German counterattacks and bought time for reinforcements. Salerno was a painful reminder that a beachhead without depth is perilously fragile. The lesson was stark. Amphibious assaults could not pause after the first waves. They had to expand inland rapidly or risk annihilation under enemy counterblows. This reality would echo again at Anzio. Anzio in January 1944 revealed the perils of hesitation. The landings achieved tactical surprise, putting troops ashore with little opposition. Yet instead of exploiting inland, Allied commanders chose to consolidate, giving the Germans time to bring artillery and reserves to bear. What followed was a stalemate where the beachhead became a death trap, shelled and squeezed for months. Anzio highlighted a truth that had haunted Gallipoli decades earlier. A beachhead is not a safe haven, but a target unless transformed quickly into maneuver space. Naval power could shield troops for a time, but only decisive leadership and bold movement could convert a landing into operational success. The climax came at Normandy in June 1944, where the lessons of every earlier operation converged. The beaches of northern France were fortified with obstacles, mines, and bunkers, but the Allies matched that with unprecedented preparation. Deception operations, from fake armies to phantom radio traffic, convinced the Germans to expect an attack at Pas-de-Calais. Airborne troops dropped inland to disrupt defenses and secure exits. Engineers cleared paths through minefields under fire, while specialized vehicles floating DD tanks, flamethrower tanks, and Hobart's funnies provided critical breakthroughs. The landings were bloody, especially at Omaha, but the Allies succeeded in putting a vast army ashore. Normandy proved that amphibious mastery meant integrating deception, technology, and overwhelming scale into one seamless effort. Sustaining the lodgment in France was itself an engineering triumph. The Allies knew that without ports, their armies could not be supplied. The solution lay in mulberry harbors. Massive prefabricated piers and breakwaters towed across the channel and assembled on the French coast. Alongside Pluto, the undersea pipeline delivering fuel, these innovations transformed beaches into temporary ports capable of feeding millions of men and machines. Traffic discipline, enforced by beach masters and naval control teams, kept the flow steady even under fire. For the soldiers slogging through sand and shingle, it may have seemed chaotic, but in truth it was a marvel of orchestration. Amphibious warfare had finally achieved the scale and sophistication Gallipoli's planners could never have imagined. By the summer of 1950, the Korean peninsula was balanced on a knife's edge. North Korean forces had swept south, compressing UN and South Korean troops into a shrinking defensive perimeter around Pusan. Supplies flowed in under constant pressure, and commanders faced the prospect of losing the entire peninsula. Into this crisis stepped General Douglas MacArthur, a man never shy of bold strokes. He proposed a landing at Inchon, a port city far behind enemy lines. To most, the idea seemed reckless. The tides were extreme, the approaches narrow, and the shoreline dominated by mudflats and seawalls. Yet it was precisely these challenges that convinced MacArthur the enemy would not expect such a move. Inchon would either redeem the war or ruin it. The geography of Inchon was more formidable than any human defense. The harbor experienced tides of more than 30 feet, leaving vast mudflats exposed for much of the day. Only at narrow windows could ships approach, and if landings were delayed, entire waves could be stranded in mud under enemy fire. The seawalls lining the port meant landing craft could not simply drive ashore. Men would need ladders to climb into a defended city. Navigational channels twisted dangerously, demanding precise hydrographic knowledge. Every detail had to be timed to the minute, every craft positioned perfectly, because the sea itself offered no forgiveness. Inchon was not just a battle, it was a race against nature. Planning for Operation Chromite reflected the maturity of amphibious doctrine born from Gallipoli's scars and World War II's refinements. Deception measures masked the true objective, with feints staged elsewhere along the Korean coast. The small island of Wolmi-do, guarding Inchon's inner harbor, became the first target, for it had to be neutralized before larger waves could enter. Carrier strikes and naval bombardments softened defenses, while reconnaissance teams scouted approaches in secret. The assault plan required the capture of Wolmi-do in the morning tide, followed by the main landings at red and blue beaches in the afternoon. It was a choreography dictated not by human preference, but by the inexorable rise and fall of the sea. The execution showcased amphibious warfare at its peak. Marines stormed Wolmi-do under covering fire, securing the island in a sharp, decisive fight. Hours later, landing crafts surged toward Inchon itself, their crews steering through twisting channels on a rising tide. When they reached the seawalls, Marines leapt out with ladders, scaling the barriers under small arms fire. Engineers blasted openings and troops poured into the city. Every element airstrikes, naval gunfire, reconnaissance, and shore parties worked in unison. It was the antithesis of Gallipoli's chaos. Precision instead of confusion, integration instead of improvisation, initiative instead of hesitation. For the Marines and soldiers on the ground, Inchon was a moment of both terror and triumph. Scaling a seawall under fire while the tide threatened to strand them was as raw a test of courage as any beach in history. Yet within hours they had secured a lodgment, and within days they were driving inland towards Seoul. The landing severed North Korean supply lines, forced a hasty retreat, and transformed the strategic balance of the war. Inchon became not merely a victory, but a demonstration that decades of doctrine, innovation, and sacrifice had borne fruit. Amphibious warfare had finally reached a point where the sea could be turned from obstacle to weapon. The comparison between Gallipoli and Inchon reveals how amphibious warfare evolved into a system of systems. At Gallipoli, planners assumed naval gunfire could suppress defenders, and that raw courage could carry men through the surf. Instead, geography and well-led defenders exposed the fragility of improvisation. By Inchon, those assumptions had been replaced with integration. Intelligence, logistics, deception, and specialized craft fused into a tightly orchestrated plan where no single element stood alone. The lesson was clear. Mastery did not come from a single innovation, but from weaving many strands together into a resilient whole. Amphibious success was never accidental. It was engineered. Intelligence sat at the heart of that system, where Gallipoli relied on outdated charts and guesswork. Inchon benefited from precise hydrographic surveys, aerial reconnaissance, and covert scouting missions. Planners could chart tides down to the hour and predict the capacity of mudflats to bear weight. Reconnaissance was not a luxury. It was survival. Without knowledge of the environment, even the best-equipped forces risked disaster. Amphibious operations turned geography into a battlefield, and mastery meant knowing every channel, current, and beach gradient before the first boat hit the water. Technology provided the tools to act on that knowledge. Higgins boats, LSTs, and amphibious tractors transformed the final yards from sea to shore, turning what had once been a deadly bottleneck into a more manageable process. Engineers devised portable piers. Beach obstacles were cleared by demolition teams, and specialized vehicles carried firepower onto sand and reef. By the time of Inchon, even the ladders used to scale seawalls were considered and planned for, showing that nothing was left to improvisation. Each piece of equipment represented decades of refinement, each designed to solve problems first exposed in failures like Gallipoli or costly lessons at Tarawa. Deception and surprise were equally vital in this system. Gallipoli's landings had been telegraphed and poorly concealed, allowing defenders to mass where it mattered most. In contrast, Inchon's improbability became its greatest shield. MacArthur wagered that the very features that made Inchon appear impossible would lull the enemy into complacency, and he was right. Across World War II, from bodyguard at Normandy to feints in the Pacific, deception bought precious breathing room for troops at the water's edge. Amphibious warfare thrived not only on force but on misdirection, using illusion as a weapon as sharp as any rifle. Above all, leadership and human resilience bound the system together. At Gallipoli, Mustafa Kemal's swift decision-making blunted Allied thrusts, while hesitant Allied commanders squandered opportunities. At Inchon, MacArthur's gamble only succeeded because Marines, sailors, engineers, and corpsmen executed with discipline and courage under the tightest of constraints. At every surf line, small unit leaders, sergeants, lieutenants, petty officers made choices in chaos that determined whether lodgements held or collapsed. Amphibious warfare was a system, yes, but it remained one animated by human grit, where doctrine became real only when men stepped into the surf under fire. The sea-to-shore transition remained the most dangerous moment of modern war. Once troops left their ships, they had no cover, no retreat, and only minutes to secure ground before the enemy could respond. It was here that doctrine, equipment, intelligence, and leadership converged or failed. Gallipoli showed the cost of neglect, while Inchon proved the power of integration. Amphibious mastery was less about dominating the enemy outright and more about controlling chaos long enough to seize a foothold. In that sense, every landing was an act of calculated defiance against both the enemy and the sea itself. From the narrow beaches of Gallipoli to the mudflats of Inchon, the story of amphibious warfare is a narrative of failure, transformed into mastery. Gallipoli in 1915 exposed every weakness-fractured command, poor reconnaissance, inadequate craft, and an enemy who turned terrain into a weapon. 35 years later, Inchon revealed how decades of lessons, tested across oceans and refined in blood, could turn those same obstacles into tools of victory. The arc between the two was not inevitable. It was forged through adaptation, innovation, and the relentless determination of men who refused to let the sea dictate their fate. Amphibious warfare became not just a tactic, but a discipline born of hardship. The legacy of this transformation lay in the recognition that mastery was never final. Each landing revealed new vulnerabilities: reefs at Tarawa, counterattacks at Salerno, kamikazes at Okinawa. Inchon's triumph did not erase these dilemmas. It showed how meticulous planning, deception, and audacity could offset them. In today's world, with precision missiles, drones, and cyber warfare, the challenges of storming a defended shore remain daunting. Yet the lessons endure. Dispersion, reconnaissance, deception, and logistics remain the keys to survival. The environment has changed, but the principles forged in the surf have not. For those who fought at the water's edge, the experience was more than doctrine. It was the visceral memory of wading through surf under fire, of climbing cliffs with rifles slung and ladders in hand, of dragging wounded comrades through sand soaked in blood. Their grit turned theory into reality, proving that no amount of machinery or planning could replace courage. Mall unit leaders, from sergeants at Anzio to lieutenants at Inchon, decided whether lodgements stood or crumbled. The system was vast, but its fate often rested on individuals with seconds to act. In the end, amphibious warfare stands as both a warning and an inspiration. It warns against arrogance, as Gallipoli showed that even great powers can be humbled by cliffs and tides. And it inspires by showing how failure can be transmuted into mastery, as Inchon proved that daring, combined with preparation, can reshape a war. From disaster on the Dardanelles to triumph in Korea, the evolution of amphibious warfare is a reminder that the boundary between sea and land is not just a line on a map, but a crucible where human ingenuity and resolve are tested to their limit.
Thank you for joining us on the TrackPad's Military History Podcast. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the battlefield, be sure to explore more articles, episodes, and series at trackpads.com.